Welcome to another episode of Lessons in Humanities. The title of today's lecture is Cotton Kingdom, Antebellum South. Today I will be discussing about the importance and the influence of cotton on the United States in Antebellum South, United States, antebellum being before the American Civil War. So this is in the 1800s. It will talk about the importance cotton had for the economy in the South and how that also increased the demand for slavery and some movements that were gaining steam at that time to abolish slavery. So if you think that's interesting, please stick around. Okay, before we begin today, please, if you are enjoying my videos, I'd really appreciate if you can give me the thumbs up or the plus sign below this video, and also subscribe. And also this PowerPoint presentation or this Google Slides presentation and many other lesson plans are available, so please do visit my store. The information is below. Well, let's begin. So we're going to be in the 1800s now, from the early 1800s to about 1861, or this chart just goes up to 1848, but this is the time within this time period when cotton became very, very influential in the United States. So it wasn't always influential until about the 1800s, and new strains of cotton became available, and more demand from the Northeast or the New England area, and also Europe made cotton boom, and more people wanted cotton. So it helped the economy in the South, but the unfortunate consequence of this boom was it also increased the demand for slavery and would ultimately lead to a civil war. So here's the timeline: 1800 1848. 1848 is significant because that's when the Mexican-American War took place, and after that war the United States gained a lot of territory, for example California and what is now Arizona and New Mexico. And there'd be a controversy on what to do with that land in terms of allowing or making slavery illegal, and that would obviously lead to the Civil War. But a few events of also note on this timeline is, if you look at 1820, the Missouri Compromise, that was the first big compromise that really split the country into two on whether to admit Missouri into the Union as a slave state or as a free state. So they made a compromise, and it was a temporary compromise because there's going to be a lot more differences between the North and the South. What else can I mention here? For example, the Tariff of 1828 and the Tariff of Abominations, that was also big because that's when South Carolina threatened to secede from the Union, and that was during Andrew Jackson's period. So that was it was almost like a civil war almost that Jackson stopped with a force bill. But the point here is the United States is growing. People are moving to the West, more and more to the West, and the controversy and the sectionalism between the North and the South continues to grow, and cotton is going to have a big part of that. Now, here is a map of the United States. So you just saw Jamestown, or you see it right there, and this is the very beginning. Okay, so I'm just going to take a couple minutes, just kind of go over the development of the United States territorially speaking, right? So in the beginning, you had Jamestown, 1607, and then up there you see there's Plymouth, that's 1620, and you have the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1630, Maryland. So as you see here, there's more and more colonies. This is not the United States of America at this time. This is British America. So as more and more people came to the United States, more and more people would create these colonies, and they would spread out along the coast at first before they started moving west. But you can see there it's moving up, and it's getting more and more people. There's the Carolinas, and people need to survive. They need to have an economy. They need some crops to sell, right? And at this time, it was going to be tobacco, especially in the South. That's what's going to help the South survive. And as it continues to grow, there's going to be more immigrants coming, right? More and more people, more and more children are going to be born in the colonies, so that's going to also develop the United States. But there's going to be some conflicts because in the North, there's the French, and also they're to the west, near the Mississippi. And naturally, there's going to be some conflicts between the British. America was British at that time, and the French. The British were Protestants, and the French were Catholics. And a lot of it had to do with territory too. They had disputes over territory, and that's going to lead to a war. That's going to lead to what is called the 7 Years' War. That's what's internationally called. Sometimes people in the United States call it the French and Indian War. So if you look at the map here is the 13 colonies. But after the 7 Years' War, it's going to double the size, or right now you can already see it getting bigger. It's going to go all the way over to there, right? And that's going to cause some conflicts with the British about being able to settle over there. And there's going to be a revolution, right? It's called the American Revolution. And then, of course, after the United States is created, shortly after in 1803, you have Louisiana Territory. And all during this time, the South and the North are different, right? So this map goes all the way up to 1861. This is what it's going to look like in 1861 when the United States is going to go to civil war, right? But here you are. The North and South is going to be more and more separate, and cotton is going to be one of those products or commodities that's going to make the United States make a lot of money, right? Okay, so this would be after the right now it's after the Mexican-American War. Okay, I hope that made sense to you. So here's the South, and those little black counties, that's where they had the most black slaves at that time. So and you notice a lot of these communities are along the Mississippi River, right? But there is the institution of slavery is quite prominent in the South at this time in the early 1800s. In the North, it's gradually being emancipated, and there's more and more abolitionists fighting to stop this institution. And many people thought it kind of would fade away in the 1800s, but it didn't fade away. See, the problem was there's more of a demand for slavery, and that demand is coming from cotton. Now I want to start with tobacco. So I don't want, this is about the 1800s, this presentation, but we have to go all the way back to the 1600s because that's when Jamestown was founded in 1607. And when it was founded, it almost didn't survive. Half the people died. They had the starving winter. The local, Native Americans, Powhatans, saved the Jamestown settlers. And they were looking for gold, silver, or other products or commodities that could make the Virginia Company wealthy, because it was actually a business venture. A little different than Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which came a little bit later. But John Rolfe found a commodity, or he found a grain of tobacco, which was new to Europeans, or it was relatively new. They didn't know about tobacco before the Spanish started coming over to the New World. But he took a strain from the Caribbean and he mixed it with a strain from the Virginia area, and he sold this kind of sweet tobacco, which was very, very popular. It was popular in the northeast of the United States and also back in Britain. So basically, Jamestown was saved by tobacco. It'd be the main commodity for over a century, and without it, maybe Jamestown would have failed. Who knows? But the thing about tobacco is it treats the land poorly, and it only can last for 4 or 5 cycles. So after 4 or 5 cycles, farmers would have to move to different lands. And over the decades and centuries, really, the land would be unusable for a lot of tobacco farms, so they'd have to move more and more to the west. So that brings in cotton. Cotton did not harm the land as much as tobacco, and it grows relatively quickly, and there's a lot of widely available land, with the tobacco lands being moved to the west. And it should be mentioned that come the 1800s, there's going to be the market revolution, which is in lieu or at the same time or similar with, chronologically speaking, with the Industrial Revolution, and that's going to create a market economy. And with this market economy, one of the the North is going to sell textiles or clothes or other type of fabrics. So this is going to increase the demand for cotton. So also at about the time, so we're back in the late 1700s or early 1800s. There was a man named Eli Whitney from the North, and in 1793 he invented the cotton gin. Right, so this cotton gin, before the cotton has little seeds in it, and you got to pick it out one by one. It could take a long time, right? So the cotton gin, it made it easy to separate cotton fibers from the seeds, and this greatly improved the production of cotton in the South. So basically, before it took a long time to pick the cotton and then to pick out the seeds, but now after you pick it, you just throw it in this little machine, and you grind it like that, and the seeds just naturally come out. So you would think naturally with an invention that makes it easier to do something, you need less laborers or less workers. Well, the thing is with there being more of a demand for textiles in the North, and this machine was made it easier to pick out the little seeds, at the same time, you needed more people to work in the fields. So the cotton gin had the influence of making cotton production more convenient and more productive, but also needing more workers. And for that reason, the demand for slavery would actually increase. Now, a little bit before that, in 1785, there was the first southern import of cotton to Europe, right? So at that time, tobacco was ruining the fields, but cotton wasn't the main commodity at that time, right? And of course, this is about the early days of the United States, and this is about the time of the Constitutional Convention. This was just a small export, no big deal. But little did people know that this would change the world in big ways, economically, and also lead to a civil war. Now, the early 1800s, there was a great demand for this luxurious, long staple cotton. It was growing on the East Coast in places like South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, a small area, not all over the South at that time. Now, the South would quickly grow in international prominence because of this. So, 1785, just a small little export, and little did they know how big it would turn into in the 1800s. This would make the South, it would put them on the map, right? I mean, it was the North with all their industries and factories and industrialization, where people thought that was a strong economy. Well, this is going to make the South economy strong. Now, there's going to be something that is discovered in 1820. It's called the Petite Gulf cotton. And the technical name is, sorry for my pronunciation, it's the Gossypium barbadense. So if anybody can help me in the comments with that one. But nonetheless, the success in the South, it led to these merchants and planters and different type of people trying to find new strains so they can plant it in other places around the South. And that's when they found the Petite Gulf. It was discovered in Mississippi, and this was really a nice kind of silky type of cotton, and it went through the cotton gin very easy. It's very usable, right? And that is going to really make the cotton boom even more. So it's called the Petite Gulf cottonseed. And at the same time, shortly after, in the late 1820s, 1830s, that's when Andrew Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, and it would be Martin Van Buren who would see it fulfilled. So there was a lot more land at that time in the Southeast. So the Native Americans were forced out of their native lands that they lived for thousands of years, and they were moved west past the Mississippi into the Oklahoma area. But this opened up more land, and there's more demand for cotton. So people are trying to spread these seeds and have more plantations because it's incredibly profitable. So it's becoming more relevant all over the South. But not just the South. It's going all the way into the Louisiana territory. So it's really spreading. And, of course, workers are going to need for that, and people are going to use enslaved labor, and that's going to add to the conflict, because when the western territories are going to become states, that's when a lot of the big debates come about spreading slavery to these new states. So we have a cotton boom. So with the Petit Gulf cotton and the available land, money flowed into the South from banks and from investors and speculators from the North. And it became the main crop of the South. It was the number one export for the whole United States, and this happened in a very short period of time. In 1793, the South produced 5 million pounds of cotton. So that's shortly after that first export, right? And right about the time of the cotton gin. And in 1860, they produced 2 billion pounds of cotton. So you can see how much it grew. And of course, 1861 is the year before the American Revolution. American Civil War, sorry. Now, this is the big point here, is cotton would greatly increase the demand for enslaved labor. So while people in the founding fathers thought slavery would slowly go away, and now in the North it kind of did. They had the gradual emancipation, but it's not going to happen in the South. So cotton and slavery. So the international slave trade was abolished in 1808. But that doesn't mean slavery was illegal in the United States. In some states it was, right? So they were doing gradual emancipation in the North, and state by state was making it illegal. Now, it wasn't immediate emancipation where, for example, New Jersey would just stop it right away, like the Emancipation Proclamation or the 13th Amendment. No, this was gradual. So some people would continue to live for many years or decades as slaves, as other blacks would be freed. But the international slave trade was discontinued, and slavery, of course, was legal in the South. Now we can see how many more slaves there were from year to year. 1790, there was 654, 121 slaves. That's according to the data, the census. 1810, 1.1 million slaves. In 1860, 4 million slaves. So even though the international slave trade was abolished, slavery continued. Now, of course, even though it was abolished, there's stories of the black market trading slaves illegally and kidnapping slaves, sometimes from the North to bring them to the South, or even from Africa and bring them over to the Caribbean or to the United States. So there was illegal slave trading that would continue. And it should be noticed that there was a significant number of freed blacks in the South. Some of them were, sometimes their masters would set them free. They would they would sign some paperwork and they would legally be free, or they would let them be free after the master died. The master would write in his will, set my enslaved labor free. And also in the Louisiana area, there were blacks that were free from back in 1803. So they continued to be free after the United States purchased Louisiana. So there was a significant amount of freed blacks in the South. Now this is a sign, and it can show you how blacks were considered at that time. It was basically just property. Because here they're selling slaves, and this sign could have been on a board, or it could have been in a newspaper. I'm not exactly sure, but this was in 1840, and this one, you can see it says 17 valuable young Negroes and men and women, field hands, sold for no fault with the best city guarantees. Okay, so field hands, so that shows you that they're probably going to work in the fields, and probably with cotton. Now this is Louisiana, this is New Orleans. It could have been sugar, it could have been another commodity or some other type of work, but it does say field hands, so it does suggest working in the field, obviously, and it could have very likely been cotton. Now the southern city. So back then in the southern city, it was growing and growing, and that was because of cotton. This picture here is of New Orleans, right across from the Mississippi River. But the early 1800s, international trade was coming from the north, but with cotton, that's going to change. The United States imported more than it exported, and that was until cotton. So that was over the whole United States. So the cotton changed the economy of not just the South, but the whole country. And between the 1830s and 1850s, the southern cities grew more and more and more. There would be traders, there would be speculators, there would be bankers, there would be lots of different peoples that were going to come to the cities to try to make money. Another thing that changed everything was a steamship, which was, of course, created during the Market Revolution. And this would make it possible for ships to go up and down the river. Now, before that, you could only go one way, whichever way the river was flowing. You couldn't get back. So if you're going to New Orleans, let's say you wanted to send some commodities or some cotton or some rice or some other tradable item, if you got to New Orleans, that's great. But how are you going to get back? So you have to go over land with your boat. But with a steamship, that changed everything. So steamships were everywhere within a couple decades in the mid 1830s or mid 1800s, and they'd be going up and down the rivers, up and down the Mississippi or the Missouri River. You could go from Pennsylvania all the way down to New Orleans. So it was like a road, right? And back then, traveling overland was very difficult. Even though they were building more roads, it was extremely difficult. So it was easier to go across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe than it was to go overland to the western parts in the Louisiana Territory. Now we also have the Southern urban class system. So there's like a quasi-class system. So this is not it wasn't like a defined one, but it kind of evolved with the cities becoming bigger, right? So there was always the land-owning elite, and they controlled the politics and the capital and the money. And I'm going to skip to 3. There was also the working poor, and they were subsistence farmers. So they made enough just to survive. And also some workers, unskilled laborers, who often worked for the elite. But there's also this new middle class, and a lot of these were the sailors, merchants, craftsmen, traders, speculators, store owners, the business people that were going to the cities. And they were really separated from the first and the third class. This is like a new class. So they're kind of like outsiders in a way. But this is what developed in the early to mid 1800s with the development of the Southern economy. Now, slave culture. Within slave communities, and you have to remember, is very different all over the South. Some people like to box it in and generalize what it was like to be in the South, but it was different all over from state to state. But generally speaking, African Americans or Africans, if they recently had just come from Africa, they developed their own culture. And sometimes they develop their own culture as an act of resistance against their masters. In the 1600s and 1700s, many African slaves, they married with people of the same ethnic group. And this helped maintain cultural traditions into the 1800s. So by the 1800s, and especially with the slave trade being over, a lot of slaves would have been born in the United States. But from generation to generation, some African traditions or local ethnic traditions from different parts of Africa would be saved. Slaves would often marry from the early days until the 1800s, and this was always a threat because if for a loving couple that got married, if one was sold, whether out of necessity or out of punishment, they would never see their loved one again. In fact, some masters, to encourage increased production, would threaten that with some slaves. They say, I will sell your wife or I will sell your husband if you don't do your work, in addition to other punishments. Now, women slaves at that time worked just as hard as men, and they worked hard in the fields. And sometimes they were domestic workers at home. And if they were going to have a baby, they would work right up until the pregnancy or close thereof. So it was very, very difficult to be a woman. And women slaves also had to be, sometimes, not always, but it depended on where, be fearful of the men masters of sexual assault or other white people, assaulting them. And then if a white person assaulted a slave at that time, they wouldn't be punished. And if the white woman fought back, they would be punished. There is a story of a 19-year-old girl in the South who was raped for years and had from her master, and she had numerous children and numerous miscarriages. And one day she killed her master, hit him over the head with a tool, I think, and she got in trouble and she got executed. So, and also within the slave cultures, they created their own version of Christianity, and it was also often influenced from traditional African religions. So Protestantism and religion and Christianity really did influence the African American cultures at that time. Religion in the South. So during the Second Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening was this revivalist movement that happened. It started in Kentucky and Tennessee area, but it also spread throughout the United States. It was very prominent in New York, but it also influenced the South, right? It gave African Americans a feeling of hope because there was this new idea of spiritual egalitarianism. So there was this idea that maybe in the outside, slaves were not treated properly or fairly, or were not treated equally, neither were women or Native Americans, but everybody had this same egalitarian ism when it comes to spirituality. So it did give a lot of slaves in the South hope. But during the Second Great Awakening, a lot of churches in the South, and certainly in the North, because the concentration on this lecture has been in the South, but in the North, the abolitionist movement is gaining steam in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s. But in the South, the Methodists, the Baptists, the Presbyterians, mostly the Methodists and the Baptists, which were very influential during the Second Great Awakening, and this is in the 1800s, the early to mid 1800s, they started supporting the abolitionist movement and speaking out against the institution of slavery. And of course, there were some preachers they justified the institution of slavery with the Bible. And at the same time, the Christian community and in the Second Great Awakening tried to convert Native Americans. So some preachers would learn to speak local Native American languages, and then they would go out and try to convert different tribes. And some would force the Native American tribes to learn English so they could become Christianized. This is a continuity in American or history, or just history from the New World, going back to the Spanish, of this idea of Europeans converting Native Americans to their traditional religion of Christianity, whether it's Catholicism or Protestantism. But Protestantism, as I mentioned in the last slide, rapidly spread within the black communities, and it was kind of hard too for black people to learn about Christianity, because even though they would go to church and they have their own congregations, there was these anti-literacy laws, which made it difficult for slaves to read the Bible. Now I'd like to talk about the Nat Turners Rebellion. So the Nat Turners Rebellion happened in 1831. This is when Andrew Jackson was president. So Nat Turner was an influential local slave in Virginia, and he was influenced by religion. He said he was visited by angels, and he got a group of rebels to fight back against the white masters, or the local white population. So he led a deadly rebellion with 55 men, and they killed 57 whites. And this frightened the South. The South, ever since the beginning, probably all the way back to 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the British in the New World, not the Spanish or the French or the Portuguese. But since slavery began in British America up until that point, there certainly was some fear of African Americans revolting against their masters. And certainly during the Haitian Revolution in the 1800s, when the slaves fought back against the French masters and won, that would increase the fear in the United States. And there would be some other rebellions, but this was a significant one. Like I said, in 1831, Nat Turner fought and he killed with his men 57 whites. And there was white terror to follow. So this is going to change the relationship a little bit between the masters and the slaves. So, for example, the people who killed, who were the rebels, they'll be executed, most of them, and some of them punished severely. And even some slaves that were not involved with the plot were killed or executed or punished severely. Nat Turner, he was able to get away for a couple of weeks living in the woods, but he would eventually be caught and executed. But there would be stricter laws. Now, every state's different, and every law is a little bit different. But some states would be extremely, strict. So, for example, stricter anti-literacy laws. They didn't want African Americans to learn how to read, and they also, where before they could go to a congregation or a church before, now that would be illegal. Or if they did meet together for church, there would have to be a white supervisor there, right? So stricter laws after the Nat Turners Rebellion, and it's only going to be 30 years before the American Civil War. And this would be a continuous fear right up until John Brown and Harper's Ferry tried to start a slave rebellion, which is going to be one of the major events that leads to the Civil War. Now, another issue at the time was honor in the South. Men, they were supposed to be men, and they're supposed to be masculine and have this kind of masculine honor. And they also fought, so it was kind of a pride thing. So they would fight, or they would have duels, or they would have sword fights. And women, they were supposed to be pure and virtuous, sexually pure, right? This is kind of known as the cult of domesticity. So this was not that you're not supposed to have honor in the North, but it was a little bit different from the North, right? So this is kind of the way people in the South were expected. They were expected to act in society. So that's it. In this picture, there's an auction where they were selling African slaves, and this is in New Orleans. And I think you can go to this building. It's like a rotunda. I'm not sure what the name of this building is, but you can go there today and visit it and see where they had slave markets and slave auctions. But the important point in this lesson is really just the influence of cotton on society and on American history at that time. Many people feel that the South was undeveloped and behind the North when the North was industrializing and most of the trade was coming there in the early 1800s. But before the Civil War, it was the South where most of the exports were coming from, and that's because of cotton. And in the North, many people were coming down to the South because they wanted to become rich as well. And also, many people often view the North as they are the ones who abolished slavery, and the South are the ones who continue slavery. But you have to remember, the demand for the cotton was coming from the North and their textile factories, right? And not all slavery was illegal in the North. There was gradual emancipation. So even up until the Civil War, like places like New Jersey, there were still some people that were in bondage. There's very little, but right up until, it took a while for the gradual emancipation to take place. And in the South, there's going to be immediate emancipation during the Civil War. That's going to be called the Emancipation Proclamation, and of course the 13th Amendment after that. But this shows you a little bit more about what the South was like, the different classes, and the economy that led to this institution to grow. So, all right, I hope you enjoy this. Please, if you've made it this far, you have to hit the like button or the plus button below. It depends on where you're watching this video. And subscribe, and please check out my store. I have a lot of really, really great teaching plans and PPTs and games and worksheets and whatnot. So I appreciate it so much. Thank you.